This is The Wilderness and the Wellspring, the podcast companion to the newsletter of the same name, about the difficult times when you want to give up on your creative pursuits and the beauty of the act of creation. I'm your host, Jeff Lunt. This is episode 2, One Significant Creative Project Per Year. If the most watched creators in the indie game dev YouTube community are to be believed, then we should all be cranking out at least one new game every month, or maybe every week or two. That's not a dig on the YouTube community. After all, it's a beautiful dream to believe that we could produce so many games per year. And I personally would love to think that I could be one of those people. But as far as I can tell, I'm not that person. And no amount of practice or productivity hacking is ever going to get me to that level of productivity. I've only recently realized that I'm okay with this, and it's something a lot of people struggle with, thinking they're not good enough at making high enough quality stuff or just enough stuff. In your creative life, maybe you want to make a beautiful painting every week, or write a novel every month, or work with 100 photographic models this year. Whatever you create, it's natural to compare yourself to others and wonder why you don't seem to produce as much as other people. For myself, it's easy for me to beat myself up for not already having a massive roster of video games that I've created to my name. But what I've found, looking back on a couple of decades now of wanting to be really great at this and not even being known, or not really having any games that you could look up that I've created online other than a few demos. I found that the pressure that I put on myself over all that time has mostly just gotten me an unhealthy dose of self-loathing and demotivation. When I made my first game as a kid, it was a tiny little game. It was a text-based game, and it only took 5 minutes to play beginning to end. But there was something unique about that moment and kind of beautiful about it. At the time, I didn't know anyone else who was making their own games on their computer at home. But nowadays, there are huge online communities of people making games all the time. And a big part of the culture of those communities, sometimes, especially if they're really large communities, is a focus on constantly producing. I've personally found that dipping into these communities can be fun, sometimes inspirational, to kind of take a look at what other people are working on. But for me, I also, on the whole, find it more distracting. And being in those large communities sometimes tends to cause me to doubt myself rather than be inspired, because I'm just surrounded by this tidal wave of what appears to be creativity and productivity, and I'm thinking that somehow I have to live up to all of that as an individual. So in creating this substack and this podcast, I realized it was time for a reset, a creative reset for myself, to reduce my involvement to just a few much smaller communities. Side note, there's an online community called the Mudcoders Guild that I absolutely love being a part of. You can find them online if you're interested at mudcoders.com, mudcoders.com. They're very welcoming, and even though I myself don't make mud games, they let me stick around anyway. So, like I was saying, in realizing it was time for a creative reset and that I wanted to turn inward a little bit, not turn away from everybody, but just focus my connections down to the people I felt closest to, or smaller communities where I felt more comfortable. And when reflecting on the fact that that makes me more comfortable, this actually shouldn't be much of a surprise, since I'm naturally an introvert. And when it comes to interpersonal relationships in person, I've always preferred fewer close connections to having a broad network of people. But more to the topic of this podcast, this week I sat down specifically to ponder my creative pacing, like how much I'm producing. I tried to resist the temptation to turn this into an exercise where I set some kind of lofty goal or to push myself beyond what I feel is natural and a pace at which that I can keep over time. And rather than turning the reflective exercise of just trying to figure out what my creative pace is into some kind of push to make myself do a lot more than I'm comfortable with, I just tried to figure out, like, what do I actually do? Like, what is my actual pace historically? And what I noticed is that I make about one significant creative project per year. Anything less than that, and I start to get the itch to do creative things. And anything more than that, and I feel stressed and sad by trying to force myself to something. Now, along the way, I do tons of ephemeral small things, like create small little bits of digital art, or I do journaling or writing, or I'll go out to see a concert or something like that. But at this pace of one significant creative project per year, that means that I'm likely to make about one fun game per year that I'm proud of, that has like a complete, it's a complete game that you can play beginning to end and is relatively bug-free. In order to meet the threshold personally for something I'm proud of, the game doesn't even have to be totally finished in a highly polished kind of, game that you would see on a major console kind of way. The game just has to be fun, and it has to be something that if somebody stumbles on it, they would feel that it was like a well-made thing that they want to play around with. Now, thinking about this pace of one creative project per year got me thinking, so what kind of creative career will I be able to look back on if that's the pace I go at? Well, I'm currently 43 years old. I still am young at heart in the sense that I still have these creative dreams I want to pursue. And I feel that I'm only just getting started in a lot of ways. But if my creative career extends to, say, age 50, then that means from the current age that I'm at, I'll probably only produce 6 or 7 significant creative projects before I hang up my hat. When I think about those numbers, it's been a really difficult challenge for me not to turn it into a game where I'm trying to make more. It's really difficult for me to not immediately think, oh, well, how can I do double or triple that? So I used to think, producing 6 or 7 games was pretty pathetic. But the more I realize that, that's just the pace that I'm going at. It's not pathetic. That's just what I'm capable of. And that's okay. When I think to other big names or well-known game designers, I also have to ask myself how many of those people have produced more than 6 or 7, like really actually good games that people consider really good. And of those games, how many were developed in a formal game studio with large teams or even medium-sized teams? And of those games, which ones took more than a year to produce? I think probably most of them. Most of the big games that are part of the cultural, larger cultural awareness, they take a lot of people, they take a lot of time, and they just take a lot of resources. And taking more than a year to produce something like that is not unreasonable, it turns out. Now, I'm not going to be well known, I don't think ever. I don't need to be well known, although that wasn't always true. Especially when I was younger, I really had this drive to be well known, but I didn't have the experience or the skill at the time, frankly, to achieve that kind of thing. I'm not sure I ever will. So I have to turn the mirror around or look at myself in the mirror, and ask myself, okay, I'm just one person working with a few talented contractors, pixel artists, composers, trying to share what I love with other people that might be interested in it. I'm not running a game studio. I do this in my spare time. This is not, this is not my full-time job. So I kind of had to adjust my expectations accordingly so that I didn't ruin the beauty of the creative process for myself by having unreasonably high expectations. So I wonder what all of you out there listening, what some of your stories might be. So I'm just going to take a moment and invite you to share some of that with me if you'd like to. You can reach me at jefflunt@gmail.com. That's JEFFLUNT@gmail.com. If you have a creative story about your struggle or struggling with feeling like you're not good enough, or you look around and you feel like there's constantly people building tons of things, and maybe you feel like you're not producing very much, or you're producing a lot, but it's not the quality or whatever it is that you feel like it should be, I'd be interested to hear from you. You can just write to me directly at that email address, and that would be totally cool. I want to close out this episode very simply with 3 creators that I think are doing this sort of slow-paced, self-aware kind of stuff well. And this is in no particular order. First one that comes to mind is there's a video game called Archvale. It's spelled Archvale. It's the reason this game caught my eye is because of the devlogs on YouTube. So if you search for Archvale Devlog on YouTube, you'll hear this guy talking about how he designed his game well over a year, I think. How he tweaked little things, how he would spend weeks and months adjusting different things, trying different things. And I was really captured by the tone of his voice, the way he thinks about things, the lack of the kind of overt, bombastic self-promotion that we see on the really big creator channels sometimes. And I just found it to be a very comfortable thing. And even though that particular genre of game that Archvale is, like a bullet storm, bullet hell kind of game, it's not the kind of game I play very often. I just found a connection to that creator. So you might enjoy that too. So that's my first recommendation. Look at the Archvale Devlogs on YouTube and just listen. Take the time and listen. The second creators I'll mention are Tarn and Zach Adams, who I'm sure a lot of people have heard of. They're the creators of a game called Dwarf Fortress that they've been building for 20 years plus. You've been able to play the game for a long time. The game had been free for a long time on their website. I think the text-only version might still be free. And the thing that really captures my imagination about what they've done, especially in relation to this Substack and this podcast, is that they have a very long-term view and love of what they're building. They also released the first version many, many years ago, and they're releasing updates all the time. And so they've got this dedicated fan base of people who just love the very unique and special thing that they're building. And I think that's really cool. Recently, in the last couple of years, these 2 brothers, Tarn and Zach Adams, they were surviving off of, I think, donations for a long time, and then Patreon contributions. And in the last couple of years, they started working with a game publisher that's more formal. And I think one of the main reasons, if I remember the story correctly, is that one of the brothers got a scary health diagnosis and needs more medication and help and stuff. And these guys were, the two of them were surviving on $30,000-$40,000 a year. And now they're doing something else. They're doing something bigger, and they resisted it for a really long time, working with a publisher because they just wanted to keep going. They just wanted to do Dwarf Fortress for the love of it and connect with the community and just make enough money to get by. And that was happiness to them. And the fact that they've been working on this one game for 20 years is really amazing. So, Dwarf Fortress, Tarn, and Zach Adams. That's my second recommendation. My third and last recommendation, again, in no particular order, there's another YouTube channel called Lost Relic Games. And this is an indie game developer who, I think he's got a kid. It's a guy, I think he's got a full-time job. This is something he does on the side, is my understanding. Like, maybe he's gone more full-time more recently, I don't know. But he talks a lot about self-awareness, sustainable creative output, and the sort of mix of the love of it with he's trying to grow what he does into enough money that he can live off of, which I think is interesting. He's been posting on YouTube for a long time, and he just seems very approachable, no matter who you are, where you come from. He just seems like a very low judgment, very introspective person who's able to talk about what he's sort of thinking and feeling. I find that pretty interesting. So those are my recommendations for any of you listening. Thank you for listening. Thank you for reading the Substack. If you'd like to help the podcast or the Substack, I do put out content for free for a whole bunch of people, for anybody, rather. I also will be doing some subscriber-only stuff, so you can subscribe to the Substack for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Again, thank you to anybody who's out there listening, whether you're a subscriber or not, whether you're a paid subscriber or not. I'm just really enjoying doing this, and I'm trying to create a sustainable, long-term creative life in addition to my regular job that keeps a roof over my head. And I just wanted to share it along the way. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.